This is a story from my own life, something I've held inside for a very long time. It's strange how a single sentence can change everything, but it can, and it did. The heavy silver frame felt cold in my mother's hands, a stark contrast to the warmth of the packed dining room at our house in Shaker Heights, Ohio. We were all gathered to celebrate my brother Mark's early acceptance into Ohio State, and as my mother raised the gleaming 8x10 photo of his grinning face, she cut through the cheerful noise with a voice as sharp and clean as glass. "You see, Sarah," she said, turning her smile on me, her eyes glittering with something that was not maternal pride, "this is what real achievement looks like. Maybe you should just focus on getting a nice little job somewhere after high school. We all know you're too dumb for college. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows." The silence that followed her words was a physical thing. It pressed in on my ears, sucked the air from my lungs. My fork, loaded with a piece of honey-glazed ham, froze halfway to my mouth. Across the table, my aunt shifted uncomfortably, her gaze dropping to her plate. My father, a man who had long ago mastered the art of strategic deftness, suddenly seemed fascinated by a wine stain on the tablecloth. Only Mark looked untroubled, basking in the glow of my mother's praise, completely oblivious to the shrapnel that had just torn through me. The silver frame in her hand caught the light from the chandelier, flashing a brilliant, cruel starburst into my eyes. My mother's smile never wavered. It was a perfect, polished mask of maternal concern, the kind she wore when she was about to inflict the deepest wounds. "I'm just being realistic, sweetheart," she added, her voice softening into a purr of mock sympathy. "I don't want you to be disappointed." Disappointment. The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was her favorite weapon. My entire life had been curated by her careful management of my expectations, which is to say, the systematic dismantling of any dream that grew too big for the small, beige box she had built for me. I wasn't the star student. I wasn't the athlete. Mark was the son who got the A's in calculus and lettered in varsity football. He was the one whose achievements were framed in silver and displayed on the mantelpiece. I was Sarah, the quiet one, the artistic one, the one who got lost in books and filled sketchpads with charcoal drawings of twisted trees and stormy skies. In my mother's carefully constructed family narrative, artistic was a synonym for unfocused, and quiet was a euphemism for slow. That night, after the guests had left and the sound of the dishwasher hummed through the house, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, her words echoing in the darkness. Too dumb for college. It wasn't the first time she'd said something like it, but it was the first time she'd said it so publicly, so definitively, as if she were passing a final judgment. It was a branding iron, searing a label of inadequacy onto my soul. For years, her casual dismissals had been like 1,000 tiny paper cuts. "Oh, Sarah's grades are fine. She's more of a dreamer. Don't bother Sarah with the financial talk, it'll just go over her head. Let Mark handle that, honey, it requires a bit more focus." I had absorbed it all, letting her narrative seep into my own self-perception. I believed her. I believed I was the dimmer bulb, the supporting character in the grand story of my brother's success. But that night something shifted. The humiliation burned hotter than the hurt. Lying there, I replayed the scene over and over. The cold weight of the silver frame. The glint in her eyes. The way everyone looked away. It wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of control. She was defining my future, closing a door and locking it before I had even reached for the handle. A strange, unfamiliar spark ignited in my chest. It wasn't hope. It was rage. A cold, quiet, clarifying rage. It burned away the fog of self-doubt she had so carefully cultivated. For the first time in my life, I didn't just feel hurt by her words. I questioned them. Was I really dumb? Or had I just been told I was so many times that I had stopped trying to prove otherwise? The next few weeks were a quiet torment. My mother acted as if nothing had happened, a master of psychological warfare. She was sickeningly sweet, offering to help me look for retail jobs at the Van Aken district, suggesting I take a receptionist course at the local community college. Not for credit, of course, just for skills. Every suggestion was a little twist of the knife, a reminder of the low ceiling she had placed over my head. "It would be a perfect fit for you, honey," she'd say, flipping through a brochure for a dental assistant program. Not too much pressure. The rest of the family followed her lead. My dad would pat me on the shoulder and say, "Your mom's just looking out for you." Mark, absorbed in his own glorious future, barely noticed my existence beyond asking if I'd seen his car keys. I was trapped in a diorama of their making, a perfectly painted backdrop of low expectations. My suspicion began to grow, an ugly, creeping vine. Was this just her opinion, or was it something more? Had she been actively shaping this reality? The thought was monstrous, a betrayal on a scale I couldn't comprehend. But it wouldn't let me go. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, when I knew she was at her weekly book club meeting, I found myself standing in front of the old oak filing cabinet in my father's home office. It was where my mother, the obsessive organizer, kept everything: tax returns, medical records, old report cards. My hands trembled as I pulled open the drawer labeled School Records. There was Mark's file, thick and bulging with awards and certificates. And then there was mine. It was thin, almost an afterthought. I sat on the floor, pulling out the contents. Report cards from elementary school, filled with my looping, childish handwriting. I scanned the teacher comments. "Sarah is a wonderfully imaginative student. A delight to have in class, though she is very quiet. Shows a remarkable aptitude for creative writing." I remembered my mother reading these and saying, "That's just teacher speak, for she doodles a lot and doesn't pay attention." Now, reading them alone, they felt different. They felt like whispers from a past self I didn't know. Deeper in the file, tucked into a sealed manila envelope, I found it. A copy of my standardized test results from 8th grade. The SAT 8 of 9. I had a vague memory of taking them, and a much clearer memory of my mother sitting me down at the kitchen table to discuss the results. "They're average, honey. Perfectly average. Nothing to worry about, but it just shows that these intense academic schools might not be the right fit." She'd sounded so reassuring, so kind. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tore open the envelope. I unfolded the crisp, computer-printed sheet. My eyes scanned past my name, past the date, to the columns of numbers and percentiles. My breath caught in my throat. Math, 88th percentile. Reading comprehension, 96th percentile. Written expression, 97th percentile. Composite score, 94th percentile. Not average. Not even close to average. I was in the top 6% of students in the country. I stared at the numbers, my vision blurring. This piece of paper was a ghost. It was the ghost of a possibility, the ghost of a different life she had deliberately buried. She hadn't just downplayed my intelligence. She had actively, consciously lied to me about it. She hadn't been protecting me from disappointment. She had been engineering it. She had been clipping my wings for years, so meticulously and so quietly that I had never even realized I was meant to fly. The rage from that night in my bed came roaring back, but this time it was different. It was cold, sharp, and focused. I carefully folded the test results, slipped them into my pocket, and put the file back exactly as I had found it. I closed the drawer, the quiet click echoing in the silent house. The game had changed. My mother thought she was the puppet master, pulling the strings of my life. She had no idea that I was finally starting to see them. And I had a new plan. I wasn't just going to cut those strings. I was going to use them to hang her. My mother's power was absolute because it was invisible. She didn't yell or throw things. She wielded smiles and concern like surgical instruments. Her control over the family was a masterpiece of subtle manipulation. She had convinced everyone, including me, that her narrative was the only truth. To my father, she was the pragmatic, caring wife just trying to shield her sensitive daughter from the harsh realities of the world. To my aunts and uncles, she was the matriarch who knew her children best. To my brother, she was the proud mother who was simply guiding her two very different children down their appropriate paths. Questioning her felt like questioning the law of gravity. Her financial control was just as insidious. All our savings, including the modest college fund my grandparents had started, were in a joint account she managed. She spoke of it as the Family Education Fund, but her language made it clear it was Mark's fund. "Once we get Mark settled at Ohio State, we'll see what's left for you to take a little course somewhere," she'd say with a benevolent air. It was never a discussion. It was a decree delivered with a gentle smile. When I tried to bring up my grades or my secret test scores, she perfected the art of the psychological checkmate. I confronted her one evening, the printed scores trembling in my hand. I found her in the living room, arranging roses in a crystal vase. "I found these," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I held out the paper. She glanced at it, her expression not changing. She plucked a yellow leaf from a rose stem and set it aside before taking the sheet from me. She studied it for a moment, a small, thoughtful frown on her face. "Oh, this," she said, her tone light, dismissive. "I remember this. You were so proud. You told me I was average," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. "You said 94th percentile was average." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with feigned innocence and a touch of pity. "Sarah, honey, you have to understand. Those tests, they don't mean anything in the real world. They give kids like you a false sense of hope. I saw those numbers and I just knew, that if you got a big head about it, you'd aim too high and end up heartbroken. I was protecting you from that. Can't you see? Everything I do is to protect you." It was brilliant. In one move, she had transformed her sabotage into an act of profound maternal love. She wasn't a liar, she was a protector. I wasn't a victim. I was a fragile child who needed sheltering from my own ambitions. Arguing with her was like punching water. She was amorphous, impossible to land a blow on. She absorbed my anger and reflected it back as my own hysteria. I saw it in my dad's eyes when I tried to explain it to him later. He just saw a confused, emotional daughter and a calm, rational mother. "Your mom has your best interests at heart, Sarah," he said, ending the conversation. I was completely and utterly alone, trapped in a prison where the walls were made of everyone's good intentions. That was the moment my resolve hardened from a fragile spark into a core of tempered steel. The confrontation hadn't freed me. It had shown me the true nature of my cage. There would be no arguing my way out. There would be no appeal to a higher authority. If I wanted to escape, I would have to do it myself, in secret. That night, sitting on my bedroom floor, the useless test scores beside me, I made a vow. It wasn't just about going to college anymore. It was about repudiating her entire version of me. I wouldn't just succeed. I would excel. I would climb so high that her voice, with its constant, patronizing whispers of my inadequacy, would become nothing but a faint echo far below. My revenge wouldn't be a screaming match in the living room. It would be the quiet, irrefutable fact of my own achievement. She had sentenced me to a small life. I was going to appeal that sentence and win, and she would be the first to know when the verdict came in. The war began not with a bang, but with the squeak of old vinyl booths and the smell of stale beer and fried onions. I got a job waiting tables at Geraci's restaurant in University Heights, a classic, old-school Italian place miles from my mother's polished world of garden clubs and brunch spots. I told her I was joining a book club that met 3 nights a week. The lie was easy, plausible. She barely looked up from her magazine when I told her. "That's nice, dear," she'd said, already dismissing it. Those nights became my lifeline. I worked double shifts, taking orders for lasagna and veal parmesan, my feet aching and my hair smelling of garlic. But every dollar that went into my tip jar, every paycheck I folded and hid in a shoebox under my bed, was a small act of rebellion. It was my freedom fund. My life split into 2. By day, I was Sarah, the quiet, directionless daughter, placidly enduring my mother's suggestions for my futureless future. By night, I was a different person. After my shifts, I wouldn't go home. I'd drive to the 24-hour library at Case Western Reserve University. I wasn't a student there, but nobody ever checked. I'd find an empty corral in the quietest corner of the top floor, and I'd study. I bought an SAT prep book with my first week's tips and I devoured it. I worked through math problems until my vision blurred. I memorized vocabulary words while wiping down sticky tables during my dinner break. I wrote practice essays on the back of order pads. The girl my mother called too dumb for college was reteaching herself trigonometry at 2 in the morning, fueled by cheap coffee and pure, unadulterated spite. The secrecy was suffocating. I had to cover my tracks constantly. I kept a spare, clean set of clothes in my car to change out of my uniform. I used public computers at the library to research universities, looking for schools that were, above all else, far away. California became my obsession. It was the geographic and symbolic opposite of my life in Ohio. It was sunshine and possibility. I fixated on the University of California system, schools with world-class reputations that seemed like a pipe dream. But the more I studied, the more my practice test scores climbed, the more the pipe dream began to look like a plausible plan. I became a ghost, haunting the edges of my own family. I was physically present at dinner, but my mind was thousands of miles away, calculating financial aid requirements and dreaming of a campus that overlooked the Pacific Ocean. The first major battle of the war was the SAT itself. I registered for it online, paying the fee with my carefully hoarded cash. I told my parents I was going on a day trip to Cuyahoga Valley National Park with a friend. The morning of the test, my stomach was a knot of terror and exhilaration. As I sat in the silent, fluorescent-lit classroom at a local high school, filling in the little bubbles on the answer sheet, I felt a profound sense of purpose. This was my Declaration of Independence, written in No. 2 pencil. The weeks I spent waiting for the results were the longest of my life. My mother, oblivious, continued her campaign. She'd leave brochures for secretarial schools on my pillow. Just something to think about, honey. A nice, stable career. She was trying to build my cage, while I was secretly forging the key. The results came via email. I checked them in the dead of night, huddled over my laptop in the dark, the screen's glow illuminating my face. I clicked the link, my heart pounding, and then I saw it. 1520. A score that put me in the 99th percentile. A score that could open almost any door. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there, tears streaming down my face, a silent, seismic shift happening within me. The girl who was too dumb had just out-tested 99% of the country. The foundation of my mother's narrative, the central pillar of my own self-doubt, had just been reduced to dust. The applications were the next hurdle. I wrote my essays at the library, pouring out a story I'd never told anyone. Not the story of my mother's cruelty, but the story of my quiet hunger for knowledge, for a world bigger than the one I'd been offered. I spun my waitressing job not as a desperate escape, but as a study in human nature. I wrote about the books I read in secret, the art I made that no one ever saw. I applied to 5 schools in California: UCLA, Berkeley, UC San Diego, UC Santa Barbara, and USC. I paid for the application fees with months of tip money. The hardest part was the FAFSA, the Federal Student Aid application. It required parental financial information. I knew my mother would never cooperate. She would see it as a direct challenge to her authority and she would shut it down. I spent a week in a state of quiet panic, my dreams stalling at the final bureaucratic wall. Then, buried in the fine print on the FAFSA website, I found my loophole. A dependency override. It was a long shot, reserved for students who could prove an abusive or neglectful home environment. My mother's abuse wasn't physical. There were no bruises to show a financial aid officer. It was a quiet, soul-killing erosion. But I had one piece of evidence: the 8th grade test score sheet. I decided to write a letter. I attached it to my application along with a carefully worded, emotionally detached statement explaining that my family was unsupportive of my educational aspirations, both financially and emotionally, and that my mother had consistently misrepresented my academic abilities to me throughout my life. I described, without melodrama, how she had hidden my test scores and told me I was not college material. I had no idea if it would work. The acceptance letters began to arrive in the spring. Because I was terrified of my mother intercepting my mail, I had rented a small P.O. box in a neighboring town, which I checked religiously. The first one was from UC Santa Barbara. I opened the thick envelope in my car, my hands shaking so badly I almost tore the letter. When I read the word congratulations, a sound escaped my lips, a raw, ragged sob of pure relief. It was real. Someone somewhere saw me. They saw my scores, they read my essays, and they thought I was worthy. San Diego came next, then USC with a scholarship offer. The final one was UCLA. I was accepted. To all of them. The sheer, overwhelming validation of it was more intoxicating than any drug. I wasn't just good enough. I was wanted. The final confrontation was inevitable. A stray piece of mail, a recruitment letter from one of the universities that had seen my SAT scores, slipped through the cracks and arrived at the house. My mother found it. I came home from my book club to find her sitting at the kitchen table, the letter open in front of her. Her face was a mask of cold fury. The smile was gone. "What is this?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "It's an offer," I said, my heart starting to pound. "From a college." "I know what it is," she snapped. "I want to know why it was sent to you. We had an agreement, Sarah. We decided you weren't going to put yourself through this. You decided." I shot back, the years of repressed anger finally boiling over. "You decided for me. You lied to me about my grades, you told me I was stupid, you did everything you could to make sure I never even tried." "I was trying to help you," she shrieked, her voice rising, the mask of civility finally cracking. "You're an ungrateful, foolish little girl. You'll never make it out there. You'll come crawling back in 6 months, buried in debt and with your tail between your legs." "No, I won't," I said, my voice shaking but firm. I pulled the acceptance letter from UC San Diego from my bag and threw it on the table in front of her. "I'm going to California. I have scholarships. I'm leaving in August. You don't have to help. You don't have to sign anything. In fact, I'd prefer it if you did nothing at all." The look on her face was something I will never forget. It was a mixture of shock, rage, and something else I had never seen before: fear. She was afraid because she had lost. Her ultimate power, the power to define me, was gone. I had broken the spell. I walked out of the kitchen and went to my room, closing the door on her sputtering rage. I didn't need her approval anymore. I didn't need her permission. The war wasn't over, but the most important battle had just been won. I had won my freedom. Leaving Ohio was like taking my first breath after being held underwater for 18 years. I packed 2 suitcases with the few belongings that mattered to me, emptied my shoebox of cash, and bought a one-way ticket to San Diego. My father drove me to the airport. The car ride was thick with unspoken words. He was a man caught in the crossfire, loyal to my mother, but now, I think, beginning to see the cracks in her story. He slipped $200 into my hand as I got out of the car. "Just in case," he mumbled, not quite meeting my eye. It was his own small, clumsy act of rebellion. My mother did not come. She did not call. Her silence was a punishment, meant to make me feel abandoned and terrified. But as the plane took off, climbing through the gray Ohio clouds into a brilliant, endless blue sky, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt reborn. The next 4 years were the hardest and most beautiful of my life. California was a revelation. I found a tiny apartment in Pacific Beach with 2 other girls and got a job at a coffee shop to cover my expenses. College was everything I had dreamed of and more. It was difficult, challenging, and utterly exhilarating. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who were curious, passionate, and driven. I was no longer the artistic one. I was a student of visual arts and communications, my 2 passions, which I had discovered were not mutually exclusive, but deeply intertwined. My professors didn't think I was quiet. They said I was thoughtful and observant. They encouraged my ideas, pushed me to work harder, and celebrated my successes. I was seeing myself through a new set of eyes, and I was finally starting to like the person I saw. I made the dean's list my first semester. I sent a copy of the congratulatory letter home. I didn't include a note. I just sent the letter, a sterile, official document that spoke for itself. I imagined my mother opening it, her mind struggling to reconcile this fact with the fiction she had maintained for so long. The phone calls from home were strained. My mother would talk about the weather, about Mark's fraternity parties at OSU, about her garden club. She never once mentioned my classes, my grades, or my new life. It was a subject she refused to acknowledge. It was as if by not speaking of it, she could render it unreal. But it was very, very real. I was thriving. I joined the university newspaper as a photographer, my artistic eye finding a new purpose. I made friends, real friends, who knew me for who I was, not who my family had told me I was. My relationship with my father and brother slowly began to thaw. Mark, away from my mother's constant influence, started to see things differently. He visited me once during his spring break. He was shocked by my independence, by the life I had built from scratch. We sat on the beach at La Jolla Cove, watching the seals. Mom always made it sound like, "I don't know," he admitted, staring out at the waves. "Like you were just lost." I never realized she was the one holding the map upside down. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was a start. It was an acknowledgement. My dad started calling me on his own, late at night when my mother was asleep. He'd ask about my classes, his voice filled with a tentative pride he couldn't show in front of her. The family narrative was fracturing. My success was the hammer causing the cracks. I poured all my energy into my studies. My mother's voice became a distant ghost, a motivator. Every time I felt like quitting, every time an assignment seemed too hard, I would hear her words. "Too dumb for college," and a fresh wave of determination would wash over me. I wasn't just earning a degree. I was building a fortress of achievement, brick by academic brick, a fortress she could never tear down. In my final year, I applied for the Chancellor's Medal, the highest honor awarded to a single graduating undergraduate at UC San Diego, recognizing outstanding academic achievement and contributions to the university community. I knew it was a long shot, but I had learned that the only shots you miss are the ones you don't take. The email informing me I had won arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in the darkroom, developing photos for my senior thesis project. I read it 3 times, the chemical smell of the developer fluid sharp in my nostrils. Summa cum laude. Departmental honors in both communications and visual arts. And the Chancellor's Medal. The little girl from Shaker Heights who was told to aim for a receptionist job had just been named the top graduating student at a world-renowned university. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost comical. I walked out of the darkroom into the bright California sun and laughed until tears streamed down my face. The revenge, when it came, was not an act of impulse. It was a carefully planned, meticulously executed work of performance art. I knew my mother's proudest moment of the year was her annual Christmas Eve party. It was a huge affair, the pinnacle of her social calendar. Our house would be professionally decorated, the food catered, and dozens of her friends and our extended family would gather. It was her stage, where she presented the curated image of her perfect life and her perfect family to the world. For years, I had been a minor, awkward character in this play. This year, I would be the unseen director. I did not go home for Christmas. I told my father I had to work. Instead, I stayed in San Diego and made my preparations. Graduation was in June, but I had arranged everything months in advance. I hired a professional photographer. I had a portrait taken on campus, near the iconic Geisel Library. I was in my full graduation regalia. The deep blue cap and gown, the multiple honor cords draped around my neck and front and center, gleaming against the fabric, the heavy, bronze Chancellor's Medal. I wasn't smiling a polite, demure smile. I was grinning, a wide, triumphant, unambiguous grin of pure victory. I held my diploma case like a trophy. I had the photo blown up to an 8x10 and ordered the most expensive, ornate silver frame I could find online. A heavy, ostentatious thing, almost identical to the one my mother had been holding that night 4 years ago when she'd passed my sentence. The final piece was the card. I bought a simple, elegant cream-colored card. Inside, I wrote just 2 sentences in my neatest cursive. "Mom, you always said a picture is worth 1,000 words. I hope this one says enough." I signed it, "From your daughter who was too dumb for college." I packaged it all up and paid for expedited time delivery. I scheduled it to arrive at 4 p.m. on December 24th. I knew my mother's party schedule by heart. By 4 o'clock, the party would be in full swing. The house would be packed. She would be at the peak of her performance as the perfect hostess with the perfect life. The doorbell would ring, and the delivery man would hand her a heavy, beautifully wrapped gift. She would assume it was from an admiring guest. She would probably, given her flair for the dramatic, open it in the center of the living room for everyone to see. On Christmas Eve, I was sitting on my small apartment balcony, overlooking the distant lights of the city. My phone was on the table next to me, silent. I didn't need to be there to see it. I could play the entire scene in my mind. The tearing of the festive paper. The discovery of the heavy silver frame. The initial confusion, turning to a flicker of recognition. And then the card. I imagined her pulling it from its envelope, her smile faltering as she read the words. I pictured her face, the carefully constructed mask of holiday cheer cracking, shattering into a million pieces under the weight of that single, irrefutable photograph. The public humiliation. The silent, screaming proof that her entire narrative about me, the story she had told to her friends, her family, herself for years, was a lie. Her power was built on her credibility, on her image as the all-knowing mother. And in one moment, in front of her entire audience, I had destroyed it. I had taken her weapon, the framed photo, the public judgment, and turned it back on her with devastating precision. My brother texted me later that night. Just 3 words, she got it. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The silence that followed from the rest of my family was more eloquent than any screaming match could ever be. My revenge was complete. It was quiet, it was elegant, and it was final. I never heard from her about the photo, but sometimes the loudest messages are the ones sent in silence. The end.